It's a pleasure to be here and to introduce Peter Hitchens and his very provocative and excellent book, The Broken Compass. Peter reminded me as we were walking in that he and I were 20 years, not quite to the month, but shortly to the month, running down the Schönhauser Allee in East Berlin, evading the warm embrace of the Volkspolizei in the great events of 1989, later to be replicated in the Soviet Union, later to be former Soviet Union. I wouldn't say our paths have crossed professionally hugely since then, but there's been a strange synergy in one respect, and that is during the Iraq War and the great denouement of the Blair military adventure. Peter and I had an excellent meeting of minds, coming from different directions, landing in a fairly similar place around the way not to conduct foreign policy and the way not to conduct issues of probity, veracity, and ethics. That's for another time. And I certainly was I was delighted to accept the offer to chair this event this evening, because partly because I've always felt this, but partly in my new guise ad index on censorship, the only thing that I feel most passionately about now is a sense of self-censorship. I can plug my own book, which is Freedom for Sale, coming out this September, courtesy of Simon & Schuster, which is not so much about free expression is a large part of it, but it is the collapse of democracy around the world. But it is this question of self-censorship. Peter may and does, to a degree, call it political correctness, but it is this question of people fearing saying things that are controversial, fearing saying things that go against the grain. I subscribe very much to Peter's view of the narrowness of our political debate and the trade of political journalism, which is to follow the herd. So really, maybe we should start with that, Peter. I was intrigued by many things that you say here, but one was when you started out at Westminster, and you're talking about political journalists doing the right thing, the done thing. They do not enjoy political arguments about what direction the country should be taking because they do not much care. They pay little attention to how the country is being governed or to the implications of legislation passing through Parliament. I remember talking to somebody at 10 Downing Street, who said to me that for all the sort of bricks that you throw at us every day, you political journalists, you could be a hell of a lot more forensic if you simply read the legislation and tried to work out which bits of the legislation we follow and which bits we ignore and which bits fall by the wayside. What's your considered view about the state of political journalism in the light of the expenses saga?
Well, I think it is absolutely true that journalists in general are among the most incurious people in the world, and that it is one of the most startling characteristics of them. I'd always realized this, and then I read Nigel Williams's wonderful book, The Wimbledon Poisoner, in which a huge number of fictional journalists descend upon Wimbledon in the middle of a murder case and come away having learned absolutely nothing, because they all knew before they went there what the story was, which is, of course, what we do. But in the case of political journalists, it's even worse than that. They are there, sitting in the middle of the factory which produces legislation, and they know nothing about it. And I realized after what felt like 8 years and was, I think, 4, working down at Westminster, that I couldn't remember having attended a single debate to the end, that I was astonished to discover how many bills had been passed while I'd been there, with amazingly wide effect, of which I'd known nothing at the time. I read them now, usually on the web, and I think, Good heavens, that went through Parliament while I was working in the lobby, and I didn't even know. And this seemed to me to be worth recording. The business about the expenses, certainly when I was there, it was well known to everybody that a large number of MPs were employing their spouses as their secretaries, and this was the scandal. The arrangement which now exists hadn't begun. But I think that for everyone to pretend that this is an immense surprise to Fleet Street is, how should I say, a little exaggerated. I should here make a small diversion to say that my colleague Simon Walters began his investigations into the misuse of the additional costs allowance in December 2002, when he exposed the case of Michael Trend, a Conservative MP, and can claim to have begun this thing. But it wasn't particularly followed, and it's largely been my newspaper, The Mail on Sunday, which has plugged away again and again at it. I reckon it was one of those scandals which was so open that people weren't really particularly interested in it.
I remember having a cup of tea with a friend who was a political journalist who had then transferred over to becoming a chief press officer for a government department. Very nice guy. And it was a period when, it was around 2002-03, when all kinds of brickbats were being thrown at the Blair government. And I said to him, gosh, you must be feeling incredibly embattled, sort of all this stuff that you have to deal with every day. And he smiled and said, you have no idea that journalists, he said, on a bad day for us, that's this government department, you, the journalists, and therefore the public, probably find out 1% of what's really going on. You have absolutely no idea. And it was a real lament about the lack of investigative journalism and the lack of knowledge or probing. Was that also your view as well?
Yes, I think what people were really possessed by was the gossip, the soap opera nature of politics. Who was up, who was down, who was out, who was in. And that was what they shared over the lunch table with the politicians. The actual political decision-making process was background noise. It was personalised. It had to be. It made better copy for them, and it made better stories. It was interesting to them. And also many of them, I think there are people working in Westminster who, if they had flats or bedrooms for political correspondence, would actually live there and never leave the premises. They find it so absorbing, but not as a political stroll, not as a kingdom of the mind where great issues are resolved, but much more as a grown-up soap opera in which they know the characters and can report their activities, their downfalls and their scandals, not political scandals. Political scandals don't tend to be reported, but personal ones, which mean that such and such a person's career is over, or such and such a person's career is rising. Read it. That's what you will find increasingly is the pattern of what's written, and it's what they are themselves interested in. It was a huge disappointment to me. I'd wanted for years and years and years to join the parliamentary lobby, and I've seldom been so disappointed by anything in my life. A lot of experiences in journalism live up to expectations. The foreign reporting particularly does, but reporting from the Palace of Westminster, apart from the free membership of a very nice, rather old-fashioned club, frankly didn't have much to recommend it, and I believe they're not allowed to have lunch on the terrace anymore in the summer.
Is that right?
Which must be a blow. Yeah. It's important to us.
In the light of, because obviously it's a peg for any discussion currently about the state of our democracy, but in the light of, but not dependent on, the issue of the expenses row, what is your general assessment of the state of our democracy and the state of our fourth estate's ability to hold that democracy to account?
I think the real thing that's been lost, and it's been lost in my lifetime, is the adversarial element. And I don't know where it comes from, whether it's Norman and Saxon, or whether it's Roundhead and Cavalier, or whether it's North and South, but there has always been, until very recently in our Parliament, and it's been crucial, a rivalry, and to some extent even a personal dislike between the two sides, which has meant that they, like two magnets, they can't come together. Circumstances force them apart, that they view everything that the other one does critically, that the opposition genuinely, quite often quite personally and passionately, used to view everything the government did as suspect, which is a very good thing to do with any government anyway. It's my view that Parliament should have a permanent standing committee on unintended consequences, which would examine every piece of legislation on the basis that it's been drawn up by idiots. But a proper hostile opposition performs some of this function. In fact, that great constitutional theorist, the Queen Mother, asked at a dinner what she thought the best form of government was. She said, a good old-fashioned Tory government with a strong Labour opposition. And she wasn't far off what you need. There needs to be a strong Labour opposition, and if there's a Tory government, and the other way around. We don't have that anymore. It's gone. And Richard Neville, the editor of the original Oz, said a very clever thing back in the 1960s. He said there is an inch of difference between the two political parties, but it is in that inch that we all live. That inch is gone, and that inch, having gone, leaves the political correspondents with no real politics to report. There's another thing in there about what journalists miss. It's Steve Richards talking to Blairites during the, I think, 2001 election, and he's reporting the Blairites saying, all the journalists are missing the point. This election is about the destruction of the traditional Tory party. And if we can win another landslide, we will have achieved that, which was actually stated at one point by Blair himself. I saw it happen, I think, Wellingborough. Amazing statement where he actually said no party should ever again stand on a platform of what he called cuts. Basically, he was saying, as far as we're concerned now, we've won such a victory that the Tories are going to have to accommodate themselves to what we believe. And that was the purpose of the 2001 election for them. And all the journalists, except me, missed it completely. In fact, I remember that press conference, I stood up. I was allowed to ask the second question I'd been asked during the entire campaign. I said, aren't you getting a bit above yourself, telling the opposition what to think? He blustered a bit, but it was, and I wrote something about it for the paper I was then working for. But that was it. Nobody else even noticed it. It was an extraordinarily significant moment. But the political correspondents are interested in something else, and they didn't report it. But the absence of the adversarial relationship between the two parties also turns politics into a kind of neutral. I heard Gordon Brown describe it as a profession today, as if you could take an exam in politics like an accountant. It's not a profession, it's a trade, like what we do. And it's more disreputable because they get paid by the public through the taxpayer, whereas we have to scribble on the backs of advertisements. And it has become a trade in which people actually set out from their early years to make a career. And what could be more inconvenient in the midst of a career to have to make a stand on principle, to have to annoy somebody, to have to upset anybody's apple cart? You're not going to want to do it. Who are they working for? Are they working for the people who elect them, or are they working for the whips? And it's quite obvious if you ask yourself for a moment, who is an MP's employer? It's not you. And it's this becoming a trade where people progress in it up a career ladder from special advisor to MP to junior minister to cabinet minister to someone who makes expensive speeches in Hong Kong. This is the progression in politics, and a lot of them end up extremely rich. But it's nothing to do with governing the country, and they're not interested in the fate of the country. They're interested in themselves, and this is absolutely epitomized in the way in which they've been bought off by these allowances, which they've now been exposed as having become dependent on, which they all are, and they're going to find it very difficult, a lot of them, to manage without it now, because they've thought for many years that they were entitled to them and they would have them for the rest of their days.
For those members of the audience who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, and just before I throw it out to questions, just set out in a few minutes, if you would, in a broader context, in a more sort of social context, your thesis about conventional wisdom and the damage therein.
Well, conventional wisdom is always wrong. It's what people used to think when they first had a bright idea about what was going on, and by the time it's become accepted, let's go back for a moment. Somebody decides that it's the case, for instance, that New Labour is right-wing. Now, this is an absurd proposition and doesn't withstand a moment's examination, but it is conventionally believed by almost all political commentators, all journalists covering politics, and most of the people who listen to them. If you actually examine New Labour, it has been probably the most radical government in this country since Oliver Cromwell. In constitutional terms, in economic terms, in terms of foreign policy, it has done the most extraordinarily radical things, and what's more, in the area of social and moral politics, which have been very important to it, it has overturned huge numbers of things which had seemed to be absolutely permanent. And yet it is conventional wisdom that New Labour is right-wing. And if you argue with it, you have to fight against the kind of miasma of how can anyone conceivably say that this is a left-wing government? I just give you that as an example. Conventional wisdom on almost any subject, the formed opinions of the political class and the political commentariat, examined for a moment, will turn out to be untrue. But people don't examine it, because who is there to examine it? All the insiders all agree. They all agree because it's a consensus. The consensus on everything is the consensus of the centre-left, or the centre-right, which is identical to the centre-left. And there you have an entire set of agreement based on a falsehood, accepted by everybody, preventing any kind of thought. I just offer it as an example of some of the ludicrous things which people believe and on which almost everything which is written and said is based. All you need to do is examine and think about these things, and they turn out not to be so. Now, my advantage in this, is which I share with John, is that I've been abroad, and I've lived abroad, that I saw in its final years the Soviet system, that I've been exposed to different cultures, and I've actually had to be confronted with facts about other societies which throw light on my own society. In fact, what I found after I came back from the Soviet Union after 2.5 years there, which I did in 1993, was that I increasingly got these strange flashes as I would experience things in Britain. I said, where does this remind me of? Something would happen, there'd be some brush with authority, or some form I had to fill in, some note would come back from a child's school. I thought, where does this remind me of? And then it would go, click, it's the Soviet Union it reminds me of. And I could see growing up around me the same thing which I'd just watched collapse in ruins and a cloud of rust in Moscow. And these experiences, which place me outside the conventional wisdom factory, I think enable me to see things about British politics which those who are constantly inside it don't see. Just as if you never stand back from a building, you never see the shape of it. But I would plead with everybody to examine the statements of the conventional wisdom factories in the newspapers and the television programs which decide what is discussed and what is actually even examined by the commentariat, and ask yourself, is this correct? Do these people actually know what they're talking about? Because in many, many cases, they simply do not.
I was quite intrigued by as you say, some of your consideration of social and moral politics. Some of the chapter headings say a huge amount of themselves. Equality or tolerance, question mark, one or the other, but not both. Racism, sexism, and homophobia, the unholy and divided trinity. And I think my favourite, sexism is rational. Tell me, enlighten the audience a little bit, beyond the shock jock headlines, what these theses entail.
Well, let's start with sexism. All right. When I was working for the Daily Express before it was taken over by that publisher of adventurous materials and controller of even more adventurous TV stations, Richard Desmond, I was sent a form to fill in to do with our use of the internet. And I was required to sign something saying that I would never do anything which was sexist. And I thought, I'm not sure about that. And I sent it back to the person who sent it with a note saying, I refuse to sign this rubbish. Nothing happened. Nobody tried to enforce it. It was the last I heard of it. And I considered how many things I had done that previous week which was sexist. And I realized that if I had not discriminated very carefully between men and women on at least 40 occasions, I would probably have been locked up. I'd certainly have gone into the wrong lavatory. And in general, it would have been very foolish. Everybody discriminates between the sexes. Constantly, ceaselessly. Men do it, women do it. And yet we're required to pretend, for the purpose of ideology, that discrimination between the sexes, which are different, is equivalent to discrimination between people of different colour who are exactly the same. And it just seemed to me to be an outrage and an abomination that the two things were linked and listed as equivalent, and also an outrage against thought and time to resist it. There are other things in there. Look, I recount there the evening when I, on a demonstration against Enoch Powell, broke through a police line outside Oxford Town Hall in, I think it must have been 1968. And having broken through the police line, realised I hadn't the faintest idea what to do next. I suppose I could have rushed into the hall and grabbed Mr. Powell by his natty lapels, but it didn't appeal to me. And all I thought as I looked at the then Oxford City Constabulary gaping at me and wondering what on earth had happened was the best thing to do was to get out of there quickly before they recovered their wits and arrested me. But I did that because I thought that Mr. Powell's speech on the River Tiber was appalling, inflammatory rubbish, and I still do. And yet nowadays, quite a lot of people tell me that they think I'm a racist. What happened to me? Did I suddenly mutate from being someone who thought that Enoch Powell was a reprehensible demagogue, stirring up racial hatred, into a racial bigot? No, I didn't. My opinions on that remain absolutely and completely the same. So racism can't conceivably mean somebody who's a racist, a racial bigot. It must mean something else. It just needed to be examined. And these things all need to be examined. And the moment you do examine them, they crumble. It's just, if things do crumble under examination, just as they crumble under mockery. If you imagine Noel Coward singing Subterranean Homesick Blues in a Shaftesbury Avenue accent circa 1958, it will sound ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. If you examine the logic of sexism, racism, and homophobia as if they were all the same thing, with any kind of detached intelligence, you will find that they are rubbish. It simply isn't the same thing. And if people want to be against conservative attitudes on homosexuals, or if they want to be against people who think that women are different from men, then they're going to have to think of a better reason for being against it than that the person involved is an irrational bigot, because reason is actually on the side of the discriminator. Discrimination is something we all do all the time. If we didn't do it, we'd be in big trouble.
On that note, let's throw it open to questions. Do say who you are and if it's relevant, who you represent.
Or don't.
Or don't. And don't be bashful. Yes, and don't be polite.
No,
I'm always polite. Ivor Gaber. Actually, I want to go back to basic. I was looking at the title of the book, and I feel you've not yet got there. The big thesis, so to speak. You seem to be skating a bit on the surface. So if that's a genuine question, is there a big... how British politics lost its way suggests something about the bigger, the holistic picture. Assuming you give us a nice answer to that one, my curiosity is this a specifically British phenomenon that has only British politics lost its way as opposed to American, French, Italian, German, to give examples? And if it is an exclusively British phenomenon, why have we lost our way in this modern or postmodern world and everybody else has kept to the straight and narrow?
It's exclusively British. That isn't to say everybody else is kept to the straight and narrow. We are the Anglosphere countries.
Can you say what it is, John?
Well, hang on a minute. Let me first of all answer one question, then another. The Anglosphere countries are blessed in having the adversarial system, more or less, both, which tends to be combined with the presumption of innocence and jury trial. And these are actually much greater guarantees of freedom than democracy. But other countries, other European countries, which are now more or less free, are not in many ways like us. France is an intensely socialist country in many, many ways, halfway in a lot of its structures and behaviours to Eastern Europe, and has been for a long time. Germany, let's not go into the complexities of German democracy and liberty, because there isn't time for it. I'm talking about this country because it is the one that I live in and the one that I'm involved in. There are parallel things going on in the United States. The United States never really had the adversarial system in politics that we have. Congress, neither House of Congress is anything like as adversarial as the House of Commons, nor ever has been. And it's their constitution that guarantees their liberty much more than the adversarial system. So it is particularly, good heavens, if I could have made it American, great, because I could have tried to sell the book in America, which has a much bigger book market than Britain ever did, especially among conservatives, but I'm afraid I couldn't do it. No, it is a specifically British thing. What is lost? In my case, what is lost is any kind of opportunity for social, moral and political conservatives to argue their case in the public square. It's just gone. I recognize that there's another half of this. As a result, my opponents on all these subjects, the social, moral and political, liberals, left-wingers, whatever expression you care to use, also don't argue in the public square. It's not presented to them. It's not presented to the public as a choice between one or the other. Since certainly the middle 1960s in this country, both political parties have either cooperated with each other or stood by while others cooperated to ensure the passage of legislation pushing social and moral, and I stress those two, as social and moral liberal agendas. It's never been debated at a general election. No one ever stood at a general election and said, right, we're going to get rid of the death penalty, we're going to legalize abortion, we're going to make divorce so easy it'll be universal, and we're going to abolish marriage. Nobody ever said it, but they did it. And it wasn't a subject of a political debate. The political parties were not divided. Right now, you may think these things are good. I think they're bad. But the fact is we've never had a public argument about them. And if you try and raise them now, then you tend to be dismissed and marginalised as a bigot or a maniac for even mentioning the fact that they're contentious. But they're not supposed to think they are.
Isn't part of the way the British constitutional system is made up, namely two monolithic parties, not allowing, which militates against politics or thought that is non-conventional, non-consensual. In other words, not this sort of grey mass in the middle. You could argue that the continental systems that you seemingly have less time for allow for political parties to grow that don't necessarily, or political opinions to be aired that don't necessarily fall into this kind of rump in the middle.
I'm not sure they do, actually. Can you give me an example of such?
Well, I mean, Germany that we were talking about, as long as you get 5%, a political party such as the New Left, Die Linke, falls very much into that sort of non-social democratic, it's pretty in-your-face, old-fashioned redistributive left politics that has been drowned out in this country under the New Labour banner.
Well, maybe you think so. I don't know. But what there certainly isn't in Germany, and which seems to me also to be absent in France, is a morally, socially, and culturally conservative formation. And the other thing about the proportional representation systems is that they do not have I find this very moving, actually, when I've seen it happen on a number of occasions. When a government in this country loses an election, it is a peaceful revolution. I love the fact that there is no transition period. I love the fact that the removal vans turn up that day and the Prime Minister's belongings are bundled into a van, he's chucked out, and that from that very moment he has no more power, he's gone, and that somebody else comes in. It is a terrific system in that it actually allows for the ejection of an unwanted government and its replacement by something new. I'd hate to have a system where you have an election and then 6 months of negotiations as to who becomes the government, in which the public have absolutely no say at all, and the government will probably include the people who were in the government before. The rule in Germany, as I understand it, you can't be in the government until you've been in the government. First of all, there's a grand coalition in which you form a part, and then after that maybe you're allowed to be a government on your own, or at least part of another coalition. But nobody ever gets to be the government from having been the opposition. It doesn't happen. But it happens here. I like it. I think it's good. I'm very much in favour of the first past the post system, because it's one of the things which has kept us from having violent revolution. I want to keep it. But the thing is that what the two parties which used to be strongly divided and to dislike each other and to fight each other now hold hands and want to be each other and declare, and Mr. Cameron says that he's the heir to Blair. And huge numbers of Blairites are openly now rooting for Mr. Cameron to take over because they prefer him to Mr. Brown. The Prime Ministership is going to be passed over Mr. Brown's head from Blair to Cameron, just as it was passed over John Major's head from Margaret Thatcher to Mr. Blair, and all done by internal party coups. This is the other theme of the book. You see, the real changes in British politics over the past 20 years have not been at general elections. They've been as a result of internal party coup d'etat. And that is how politics now proceeds. The political elite disposes, it then puts before the electorate a non-choice, in which they're stampeded into giving somebody or other a ludicrously large majority, and they then govern as an elite.
Ivor, can I just come back to you? I mean, wearing your political studies hat, do you recognise this thesis of the narrowness of the political debate here?
Well, I certainly, when Peter was talking about Cameron being the heir to Blair, I clicked. I was actually just thrown, I'm glad you asked me that, I was thrown by your last sentence because I'm still struggling to see Mrs. Thatcher, Sir Keith Joseph and that ilk that came in 1979 as part of this cosy left-wing progressive consensus. Surely that was a break.
Not really, no. Margaret Thatcher got rid of a lot of coal miners and steel workers. But the number of state employees has not seriously reduced. Instead of coal miners and steel workers, we now have condom outreach workers.
Your social agenda
in huge numbers.
Your social agenda you were talking about.
Go on.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher was not exactly an enthusiastic supporter of the progressive left social agenda.
Well, hang on a minute. Her government introduced the GCSE, a disaster for rigorous education, but a huge step forward for egalitarianism. Her government continued an enormous welfare state and a health service which is bigger than the Red Army.
For example, which many people saw as an attack on gay people's homophobia, etc. I mean, without going into the merits of it, you cannot portray the Tory government's move on clause 28 as part of the code of progressive.
As far as I know, it was never once activated. I know of no occasion when anybody was ever affected by it. It was purely symbolic. It was symbolic, and now and they've now it's one of the few culturally conservative things which the last Conservative government is now actually excoriated by the Conservative Party itself, which beats its breast and says how sorry it was it ever did it.
At the back.
Luke Douglas Hume, a freelance journalist. Which, if any, was the last politician for you, Peter, that really cut the mustard, wasn't a sheep, really stood out and had a big changing effect on Britain?
Well, there are two different questions there. If you mean which do I approve of and which have changed things, they're two different answers, because almost all the changes that have taken place in this country have been for the worse.
No, I mean...
And the restaurants are a bit better, otherwise I think generally it's pretty terrible compared with what it used to be.
I mean combined, so someone who you think was willing to, you supported them, and they did actually have an effect. So are you just really liking ineffectual, sort of angry people?
No, it occurred to me. I mean, I sit each week and I write a column in the national newspaper, which is a tremendous privilege, for which I'm terrifically grateful. And people write to me and say, well, thanks very much, you say all this stuff, but what are you going to do about it? It seemed to me to be a perfectly reasonable question, so I sat down and I thought, what am I going to do about it? And I thought, well, it would be very nice to go into parliamentary politics. And why can't I? And I considered why it was that I couldn't, which I obviously can't, and it is because all three major political parties are in the grip of the same consensus, which regards what I say, but what I know from what I do, to be, I wouldn't want to quantify, but representative of a fairly considerable part of the population, regards what I say as unsayable, unthinkable, and politically intolerable. The other thing that I know about what I think is that by and large it was what almost everybody thought in this country when I was growing up. And yet by an extraordinary process, it's now become thought crime and outrageous in a way which the things which are now popular were outrageous when I was growing up. And I can't help thinking there's something peculiar about this process. Maybe both sets of views have their virtues, but for an entire worldview to pass from having been commonly accepted to having been something which brings you quite close to the danger of prosecution in the course of 40 years is a very odd process, and I find it objectionable.
But Peter, what about the specific point?
I don't need to approve of any of them. Why should I? I regard the government of this country since the war as, by and large, disaster mixed with incompetence, mixed with cretinism. And I really can't see why I have to reach out and say any of these people is any good. It's been a very badly run country. Which is now suffering from entering one of the stupidest wars ever engaged in by anybody in the world ever. And here we are, we sit there, and the people who are responsible for it and people who didn't object to it when they had the power and the responsibility to do so are still sitting in positions of prominence, power and privilege, and some of them are making a great deal of money out of tootling around the world making vapid speeches. Nobody has been punished because there is no opposition. And I think it's time we had one, and I would like to be in it.
So just in a word to answer the specific point, you cannot identify a single senior politician since the war that both has changed things and changed things for the better.
No, no, absolutely
not.
That's
fine.
No, it's a catalogue of disaster.
Fine, thank you. Gentleman there, and then the lady there, in the white shirt and the tie. Yeah.
Thank you, Conor Hennebury. Interested in your comments on the broken compass, and interested in particular in why you think it's broken and how it can be fixed. And you've spoken a lot about the problems with the journalistic trade and what needs to change there. What are the things you think need to change with the political system, with how political parties are organised or how politicians are chosen, not in terms of the specific policies they should pursue, but the way in which the system should work to fix the compass?
Well, policy has to come into it a bit, but look, thank you for asking that, as they say. It's the one I was waiting for. We have, though I have a feeling there probably aren't many people in this room who can help me exercise this, we have an amazing opportunity before us at the next election, which we're busily avoiding taking. You can't sack the government at the next general election. Whoever you vote for, you'll get the same thing. It will be more or less identical. But you can sack the opposition. People have gone on and on about how the country needs reform. The House of Lords, which seemed to me to be a very acceptable body, has been reformed, and the civil service has been reformed by putting Alistair Campbell in charge of it, and all kinds of other things have been reformed. And there's been general support for this. But the one thing that nobody thinks of reforming is the political parties. Let me make a small point. You may think that at a general election you vote for your choice of government, but you don't. This is a fantasy. At a general election, the two major parties, which are established in some mysterious way, the two major parties put before you candidates who've been selected in private meetings, secretly, without your knowledge or understanding, and you, depending on which political tribe you belong to, then go out and vote for them. Even if they were Alsatians, you'd vote for most of them, and you do, and that's what happens. And it seems to me that people underestimate hugely the power of the political parties and the need to reform them. And they could be reformed. Now, I concentrate on the Conservative Party because most of the people who read me support the Conservative Party, and it's I've dedicated my life to in the way that Emile Zola at one stage said that until Dreyfus was freed, he wasn't going to write about anything else. I can't quite do that because the editor wouldn't approve of it, but I genuinely believe that my life's mission is to destroy the Conservative and Unionist Party, because if only one could do that, we might get a serious Conservative Party which would produce all kinds of changes. Now look, imagine two corpses in the later stages of rigor mortis propped against each other. Knock one of them away, and the other one falls down. Now, both the political parties are corpses. When I was growing up, they had millions of members. People went to their meetings. People voted for them enthusiastically. Now they're both dead within. They have nothing to do. If the Conservative Party fell, what would hold the Labour Party together? Nothing. The Labour Party is harmonious as Yugoslavia. They loathe each other. They can't stand each other. The only thing which keeps them together is the old, it's like an Animal Farm when the pigs say, if you don't do this, Jones will come back. In the Labour Party, it's if you don't do this, Thatcher will come back. And that's the only thing that holds them together. The Tories collapse, and they can't say that it's Thatcherism coming back, and they have a more rational, intelligent opposition. They haven't got anything either. So you could join me in my project, but if you're Labour voters, it won't do. But the Conservative Party could not withstand a fourth election defeat. That would do for it. If it lost again, it would collapse and split. And the possibility would then exist for a complete reformation of political parties, so we could have one which represented one genuine view in the country and one which represented the other genuine view in the country, and we could argue rationally about how we wanted to run the place. Instead of the divide, which ought to run down the middle of the House of Commons, running between the House of Commons and the country, as it were it now is. It's attainable. People could do it. It's a power that people have. They only have it this election. If the Tories win the next election, then I'll be dead before the opportunity comes up again to get rid of them. But which is one of the reasons I'm so dedicated to doing it now. But we really do have at the next election an amazing chance to trigger a reform of the political parties, which is extremely necessary, very badly needed, and it could be done. And so that's what I advocate.
I'm slightly confused with that, just the specific instruction you have in mind. What would you therefore advise Joe Public, who goes to the ballot box with a choice of Conservative, Labour or Liberal, or some sort of independent fringe candidate? What would you advise them to do? I
would absolutely stress that one of the most important rights in a free country is the right not to vote. You don't have to. There is absolutely no obligation on you to vote.
But how would that bring down the Conservative?
Well, if people wouldn't vote for them, then they won't get in.
Then so you'll recommend a better case scenario than a Cameron victory is another Labour term in order to destroy.
Well, that would be the inevitable result. But the idea that Labour wants to win the next election is plainly absurd. They're dying. They're dying to get out of it.
Someone has to benefit from the non-vote.
Well, yeah, the people benefit. What they benefit from is the collapse of the Conservative Party. That's the great benefit. Okay. You can achieve that. You can't change the government. I say, but there is an illusion that Labour are sitting there saying, "Oh, we really want to win the next election." If they win the next election, they have to stick around and do the washing up. If they lose it, they'll go off and make money in quangos and directorships. There's not so.
Being superseded. Right, lady there's been superseded. Gentleman there right next to you. And then over here there were one. Any hands here? Okay, fine. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yeah, on foreign policy, do you think the two parties are singing on the same hymn sheet?
Absolutely.
And yes, let me finish.
Yeah. Sorry, so one question is nice.
Yeah, just a follow-up. Because I come from Africa myself, and in most African countries, as you know, corruption is second nature. Mm-hmm. And I come from Congo, and I write about it a lot. I denounce it. But the answer I get is that, well, what about where you are living in London there? Corruption is happening there too. So I get myself shut up, basically. So what do we do?
As to what we do about Africa, I wouldn't dream of trying to suggest it either now or later. But on the question of the two parties being the same, we know about the disgrace of the Iraq War when the opposition didn't do its job. We should also know about the equal disgrace of the Afghan adventure, which is never debated in Parliament, has never been properly discussed in Parliament, has not been opposed, has not been questioned, has not been examined. And here we are in this immense entanglement, which could lead us, as far as I can see, to taking sides in a civil war in Pakistan if we carry on at this rate, and nobody knows why we're there. Can you imagine? And then the other ludicrous nonsenses of the complete absence of debate over the biggest political revolution to overtake this country probably since Henry VIII, that is to say the takeover of almost all our political sovereignty by the European Union. There is no disagreement over it. It's too big for there to be no disagreement over it. Why does nobody ever say that, why does nobody oppose it? Why does nobody suggest for an instant that it might be better if we ran our own affairs? It extends, as you rightly point out, into foreign policy, and it's also true that the corruption which you speak of, which is the result, I think, of consensus and of an absence of adversarial politics, discredits any attempts to fight corruption in other countries or to suggest to other countries that they should clean up their own arrangements. How can we offer lectures to anybody on this subject? But again, where is the disagreement? Where is the adversarial politics? Where is the argument? Enormous issues, and nobody even discusses them.
Can I reconcile what you've just said with something that you said earlier when talking about no disagreement over the huge exodus of sovereignty to Europe. At the same time, you said since the war, Britain has been a very badly run country, a study in disaster and incompetence. Maybe it'd be better for somebody else to run it then.
Well, I'm not myself convinced that it would be any better to be run by other people. Nor would I say that the incompetence is unconnected with the desire to be run from abroad. In fact, it largely stems, and if you read Keith Kyle's wonderful book on the Suez Affair, you'll find a specific remark by Konrad Adenauer, which will send a shiver down your spine when you read it about this. It largely stems from the incompetence of the British government over the Suez Affair in 1956, this absence of confidence ever since in being able to run our own affairs that we've suffered from. An overreaction. Adenauer said, Europe will be our revenge for the American, what he regarded as the American betrayal of France and Britain over Suez. This is a very, very deep problem, very, very deep, and I can actually remember Suez, amazingly enough, a very, very deep problem of a loss of confidence in our own ability to govern ourselves. You could argue, if you want to argue, that we're so finished that we have to be run by bureaucrats from the Low Countries, then that's a point of view, and I'd like to hear it made, actually, because so many of our politicians seem to believe it. I happen to think that we'd be better off running ourselves. I believe in national independence, liberty and sovereignty myself, and I don't think you get them from foreign rulers. But if that's what you want, argue for it. I'd like to hear a political party stand up and argue for the surrender of our independence to a foreign power. I'd really like to hear someone say that's what we want to do, so that we could discuss it and decide whether it was what we wanted to do as a country, but we never, ever do.
There was some... Sorry, you've asked. Yeah, lady here.
I'm a bit confused about the whole you have the choice not to vote issue, because I've voted in 2 different countries now, and it's always been a choice of choosing the lesser of 2 evils. You're never voting for somebody, you're always voting for the guy that's slightly better than the guy you don't want to get in, or woman that you don't want to get in. So I'm at a bit of a loss to understand how not voting at all is better.
Well, it's sometimes better. And on this particular specific occasion, we have a discredited, politically bankrupt, dying party which seeks to gain election on the basis that it will be exactly like the government it hopes to replace, which, if it collapsed, would... Well, let me explain. So there's just a small diversion before I get back to this. Jonathan Swift once said, and I think he was absolutely right, you can't reason a man out of a position he wasn't reasoned into in the first place. Most people do not vote because they sat down at some point and thought, after a long process of discovery and inquiry and debate, I've concluded that I'm going to vote Conservative. They vote Conservative or they vote Labour because it's what their parents do. It's what their friends do. It's what the people they want the approval of do. It's a habit. It's a tribal act. It's almost entirely thought-free. Now, there's a minority who think about voting, but in most cases, you cannot detach people from a political party by a reasoned argument. Believe me, I've tried. You cannot do it. If the Conservative Party loses the next election and loses it in a humiliating fashion and goes down the plumbing as it so richly deserves to do, then those people, the conservative elements in this country who've habitually and tribally voted for it, will no longer be able to fancy that they have a friend at Westminster. They were wrong to think it for the past 30 or 40 years, but they've believed it. But if it ceases to exist, they will actually have to think about politics for the first time in their lives and will be open to the possibility of a serious political party which will be genuinely conservative. Short of that destruction and collapse, this will not happen. It is a unique opportunity which the British electorate happen to have now, in which the exercise of the right not to vote will have much more effect than the exercise of the right to vote, which is why I urge it. You look at totalitarian countries and you'll find that the fetish of democracy is an entirely worthless thing. They all have votes. In the Soviet Union, they used to have votes where Stalin got more votes in his constituency than there were people. These were explained by the fact that the people were so enthusiastic about Comrade Stalin that they trooped over the boundaries of the next constituency to go and vote for him. But the truth was that if you didn't turn up to vote in the Soviet Union, you were in big trouble. And there are a lot of other countries where this is the case. You don't come and you're in trouble, which is one of the reasons why anybody who's had any experience of a totalitarian country recognizes the right not to vote is as valuable as the right to vote. On this occasion, it's not such a declaration of liberty, but it is an enormously effective thing which you could do. If people vote conventionally at the next election, and if they do as the media classes and the establishment in general are trying to panic them into doing, which is to vote for a new Blair in the shape of David Cameron and the Conservative Party survives, nothing will change in this country at all. Absolutely nothing. There'll be a brief period of government in which the accents are different, but everything else is the same. It will fail, the Labour Party will come back, and then we'll be back into the same old cycle of everything that we have now. If, on the other hand, people say, right, we're not voting for this, we're not being stampeded into voting, just look at the behaviour of a certain newspaper, which has got the details of the MP's expenses claims. For 2 days, it filled its paper with stories about how Labour MPs and ministers had been doing funny things with the additional costs allowance. Okay, it's perfectly true, they have. But they knew, and they were in possession at the time, of information which told them that Conservative MPs and Conservative front benchers have been doing the same thing. What is the purpose of this? What will be solved? What difference will be made to our society? What reform will take place if you simply replace one centrist Labour government with another centrist Labour government? How will that change the existence of a greedy political class? How will it change anything? Nothing will change. It simply means the handover of, it means change without alteration. But if the Conservative Party fail to win the next election and are left with a fourth defeat and the certainty that they will almost certainly never win another election, they'll come to pieces. And then the process which I described, the first corpse collapses, the second corpse collapses, and you're open to reform. Real reform and change.
Why does the second corpse collapse?
Because as I say, the bogey of the return of Thatcher, which is a fantasy anyway, is the only thing that keeps Labour together. You must have noticed during all the votes in Parliament when Blair had to really force them into the lobbies, this was the argument the whips would use. They would go down into the voting lobbies and say, if you don't go in there now and vote for Tony, then the Thatcherites will be back. That was their final argument. It's all they have. The Labour Party is not a unified organisation. It is in many ways institutionally dead. It's just, it won't fall as long as it's got the Conservative Party to keep it together. The process has to start with one and then the other.
I'd quite like in the time remaining, I mean, obviously people ask whatever they want, but to broaden the discussion to some of the more cultural elements in Peter's book. We alluded to them right in our chit chat at the beginning about gender politics, race politics, homophobia, and broader things. I mean, obviously people just ask whatever they want, but I think that would be an area we've done quite a lot on conservative Labour and the potential merging of the two. Yes, lady there, and then the lady there.
On the issue of sexual discrimination, I think you've just got your language wrong. When you're talking about differentiating between men and women, yes, they are different. I don't think that anyone that works in discrimination would say that they weren't different. And treating people differently is of course, you know, the polite thing to do and very necessary. But discrimination is actually about differentiating between people at the detriment of one. And if you're saying you're doing that up to 40 times a week, then I think you need to think about that.
Who said anything about detriment?
That's what discrimination is.
Is it?
Yes.
So, for instance, what do you think about the government having a quota, a target which it strives to reach and has been striving to reach for the past 10 years, which says that 14%...
The word positive is put in front of that.
Wait a second, I have to finish. I have to ask you what you think about this. 14% of firefighters, as we must now call them, must be women.
And your problem is?
My problem is it's absurd.
Why?
because
there are other criteria on firefighters. They have to be of good health, they have to be strong.
Well, hang on a minute. You asked me why I have a problem with it, and I'll tell you. Women, on average, have half the upper body strength of men. Now, I weigh, I hate to admit this, 13 stone, 5 pounds this evening. If I were to be unconscious in a burning building, do I want to be rescued with somebody who hasn't got the upper body strength to carry me, or do I want to be rescued by somebody who has? And yet the government has, as its settled policy, a plan to force the fire brigades of this country, which they're no longer called, to employ large numbers of women who wouldn't be able to lift me. And has changed the strength and health requirements of the fire brigade so as to accommodate this. Is this a sane policy?
Okay, let me ask you another way then.
Well, no, I mean, you haven't answered my question. What do you think of it? Are you in favour of it or not? Do you think it's good? Do you think you think 14% of every fire brigade should be women, even if they can't carry me or lots of other people out of a burning building?
Well, yes,
that's good. You're in favour of that.
Yes, because
well, in that case, our disagreement is clear. I think that's crazy. You think it's sensible. It's
on another level,
yeah.
of those 40 discriminations that you mentioned that you made in that week, how many of them were of government policy of that level? You know, what were the discriminations?
Well, they were just personal things.
What were the examples?
No, different. I stood back and opened doors for women. I didn't go into.
That's not discrimination.
I didn't go into the women's
That's not discrimination.
Oh, you may not think so, but lots of people do.
Well, it's not to the detriment of the woman, is it?
Lots of people do. Yes, a lot of people.
Well, then you're getting your language mixed up, aren't you?
A lot of people will tell me, and I've had actually people in the BBC say, "Why are you doing that?"
I think you should look up the word discrimination in the dictionary.
I have looked up discrimination in the dictionary. I advise you to do the same.
Right, I've got this wonderful vision in my mind about whether you would pick up, whether you would even try to pick Peter up in a burning.
You don't have to. You don't have to try.
Whether you'll be given the opportunity or not. Right, yeah.
You might not want to.
You spoke earlier of the extraordinary process that transformed this country into a group of people that you said agreed with your viewpoint to a group of people which didn't.
Could you speak louder into the mic, sorry?
I was wondering what you thought this extraordinary process was and whether it was something...
Sorry, what extraordinary process was that?
That changed the viewpoints of people in this country from people who agreed with your viewpoint now to people who don't.
That, yeah.
And I was wondering what you thought that extraordinary process was and whether that was a symptom of the breakdown in British politics.
I think I would blame a lot of it on the primacy of television as the main cultural force in the country. I find television terrifying. I think it's a hugely conformist force. I think that particularly, I mean, I would rather give a small child neat gin than leave it unsupervised in front of a television set, and yet millions of children are left unsupervised with television sets in their rooms night after night after night. And I think that the way in which it takes over the individual imagination imposes the same ideas, imposes the same sense of humor, the same jokes, the same attitudes on people is actually verging on the terrifying. And I think the fact that television broadcasting is largely under the control of one side in the culture wars, and the fact that television has this power may have something to do with the fact that the change is taking place, is probably the most powerful reason why it's happened.
Yep, at the back. Is that a hand?
Peter, Sean Curtis Ward. If you think our political system is so bereft, why don't you start your own political party? The New Conservatives, perhaps?
Well, interesting. Look at what happened to Richard and Judy. You'll get the point in a minute. Richard and Judy, when they had a show on a main terrestrial channel, had a huge audience. They then shifted to a non-terrestrial minor channel, and they've disappeared off the face of the map. The political parties are similar to the main terrestrial channels. If you don't control one of them, then starting a new party you're immediately subject to Kissinger's law, which is that it becomes it's nothing but a series of people having disputes with each other because there's nothing else to do. He was asked, why are academic disputes so bitter? And he answered, because the stakes are so small. And that is, you look at I get letters from new political parties about once a fortnight. We've set up a new political party and we think you might be interested in it. I say, I'm not. Because I know that new political parties will fail unless one of the existing political parties has collapsed and split and there is a vacancy. I watched the very, very near success of the SDP in supplanting the Labour Party in the 1980s. And I concluded from that several things. One, that if the Labour Party hadn't been almost on its last legs, it would never have got as far as it did. Two, that if they'd waited a bit longer, and if the Labour Party hadn't been saved by Margaret Thatcher, which it was, they would have succeeded. And I've thought for some time that if only I could persuade certain people whom I won't name here to form a Tory gang of four, that the same process could be achieved. But you cannot start parties, even if I were a multi-billionaire, which I assure you I'm not. You cannot start parties in this country out of nothing. To create a new party, you have to have a space. One of the two big parties has to be in serious trouble, which is why I work for it. After that, then there is a possibility. It exists. But before that, it's Richard and Judy time.
Yeah, lady there.
I'd just like to come back to your comment about television being the primary driver of the situation we're in now, because I'm really trying hard to work out how that could be the case. I mean, I'm in my sort of late 30s, and when I was growing up with television, there was hardly any television sort of on. And I'm just trying to understand how my generation and those people who are voting, so in their kind of late 20s, early 30s, have turned out with brains of jelly, to the extent that the television they're watching in their 20s and 30s is actually kind of determining how they think, to the extent you seem to feel must be the case if they're voting, if they're then voting in a way which
I'm not talking about voting.
All right, so well,
this is a great BBC mistake to imagine the only bias you can be capable of is about voting.
How we end up in the situation that we're in, where we've ended up, and you've said it's caused by television.
Well, so I have to commend you to one of my previous books, which is also published by Continuum. It's called The Abolition of Britain. It contains 2 chapters on this subject, one of which examines the enormous propagandist role which soap operas have in the formation of opinion in our society, which is deliberate, and ever since the Archers, which was originally set up as a government information front, has been the case. And the other one, which dwells a lot on the ideas of Neil Postman, who wrote an excellent book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death, which I commend to you, but also on the warning given by T.S. Eliot when television was introduced to this country. But I haven't time to go into all the facets of how powerful television is in forming culture and in making people conformist. But if you seriously maintain that you, at the age of 30, have watched very little television, then you must be a very unusual person. I love that question. Are you seriously saying? Yep, I am. I am seriously saying that exact thing.
Am I allowed to finish my question?
Please, yeah.
That EastEnders has more of an impact than The Sun, or whichever paper was putting, will the last person to leave turn the lights off. So you think the gradual watching of TV had a bigger impact on the press in forming people's decisions in those sort of situations?
You're mixing up two things.
In what way?
Well, I said this isn't about party politics. No, look. My book is tangentially about party politics. Party politics are essential in a country governed by the vote. But my book is about how party politics might actually be harnessed to reflect instead of deny the real divisions in our society. But the idea that this is all about Labour versus Conservative, Neil Kinnock was going to lose that election anyway. The idea that the Sun lost it for him is a fantasy of Kelvin Mackenzie. The election was lost. I was there. I've also been blamed for helping to lose it for him, but I deny responsibility, much as I'd like to claim it. But it isn't the case. But it is a different process, the formation and propagation of certain social attitudes. And EastEnders is not one of the programs I particularly name. Grange Hill, I think, enormously more influential, for instance, than EastEnders. Well, in what way? The government actually deliberately used it, and consciously and openly used it, for instance, to spread various propaganda about drugs and its attitude towards not the prevention of drug use or the prosecution of drug use, but the idea that people could take drugs safely, which has become the harm reduction idea, which has now become very common in our society. Read the book. I can't say that other people don't want to listen to me giving you a summary of 40 pages of detailed argument and evidence. It's called The Abolition of Britain. If you're really interested, instead of just trying to say, oh, I can't understand this and annoy me, then read the book. Otherwise just carry on saying what you're saying. It is a cogent argument which I would be interested to hear your response to when you'd actually read it.
I think we should continue that bit afterwards. Maybe we've got time for one more question. You haven't asked a question, have you?
No, he hasn't.
Gentleman here.
Been trying for a long time, too.
Campbell Taylor. How would you respond to the accusation that your thesis that you were espousing earlier is a sort of equivalent of the one that Tony Benn was espousing in the 80s, that there's a sort of, you know, if only people were given the opportunity to be able to vote for sort of pure socialist ideas, the electorate would actually like that. Sort of right-wing.
Well, I don't think there's a parallel particularly. I'm not saying necessarily that my ideas would win. I just like them to be given a try. As for Ben, I find myself liking him more and more as the years go by, because he does actually, he makes this very good point that in politics there are either signposts who stick to what they say, or weathercocks who whirl around because they tell you what you want to hear. And he has been a signpost, and he's also been dead right on the issue of the liberty of the subject, and dead right on the issue of the European Union. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for taking a lot of mockery and worse, some of it from people like me in the past, and sticking to his gun. So I don't mind at all being compared with Mr. Benn. In fact, I take it as something of a compliment. But the idea that I haven't said that if my ideas are put to the test, they'd win, because I don't know. What I would like is to have them at least given a chance to be put to the test.
Okay. Unless anybody hugely disagrees, I think we should wrap now, continue in the bar in discussion. We've had a very rich conversation. Credit to Tony Benn. Gin to your children. Pernicious Grange Hill. Disastrous incompetent governments since the war. And my favourite, which is rescuing Peter's 13-stone bulk from a burning building. But on a more serious note, this is a very rich, interesting, involved, and I found it very involving book. I do recommend that you avail yourselves of a copy. Are you doing any signing, scribbling?
Well, I think people probably prefer to have the rare unsigned copies.
They always sell for more, but anyway, signed or unsigned, do avail yourself of your copy afterwards, and do give Peter Hitchens a round of applause. Thank you very much.